Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm a little man from Moody's, not a big man from Moody's, by the way. Thanks, as always, to LARIBA, to Dr. Yahya and his colleagues for putting on this conference and for giving me the opportunity to speak. If I've counted correctly, you've listened to 13 presentations so far today, and all that stands between you and a well-earned break is me and Mahmoud. So I think we'll keep it fairly.
Many questions and answers. Many questions and answers, yeah.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the abstract summary of the paper that I have, and that'll take a minute or two. And then I have, after that one, 6 slides. So I'll speak briefly on each of those 6 slides to try to amplify some of the ideas. And as Dr. Yahya has implied, where I'm coming from here is that most of my career I spent writing about or analyzing Middle Eastern financial institutions. I'm less involved in that now, more involved in European capital markets. So what I hope I'm doing here, what I hope I'm bringing to the party, is an understanding of Middle East and Islamic financial markets, but also now of Western practices and regulation. So the underlying points I'm making here are that the events of 9th of September and their repercussions will constrain the development of Islamic finance to some extent, but particularly in those areas where Islamic finance interacts with Western capital markets. But the extent of those constraints should not be overestimated. Many of the multiple aspects of Islamic finance are driven by religious piety and social sentiments, often both, and these are impervious to the heightened scrutiny of Islamic institutions and the increased hostility to Islamic institutions, which we've seen coming from some circles since 9th of September, since 11th of September. One of the clearest consequences of 9/11 will be the demand for greater disclosure by financial institutions and with Islamic connections. But this should be seen in the wider context of international moves to improve accounting and auditing standards after events such as Enron, and a desire which predates 9/11 to tighten the regulation of offshore financial centres, and moves to strengthen and standardize financial reporting, again, which is a long-term trend which predates 9/11. The effect of 9/11 on domestic politics in Muslim countries will also impact the development of Islamic finance. I'm going to be frank here. Regimes with Muslim populations, undemocratic almost without exception, now face a heightened challenge in managing popular Islamic sentiment, which has been stirred up both by the events of 9/11 themselves and by the West's response to those events. On one hand, such regimes need to allow Islamic sentiment to vent its anger. On the other, they're seeking to contain any Islamically charged challenge to their right to rule. So the treatment of private Islamic institutions, including financial institutions, is a significant tool in managing that Islamic sentiment. Those are the broad themes. I'm going to run fairly quickly now through 6 slides. And I'm starting off with a quote. It's very bad practice. You should never start a presentation with a quote from someone else, but that's what I'm doing. And this is from Fred Halliday, who wrote a very good book, which was published just a few months ago. There are 2 frequent responses to any great historical event, both inappropriate, if not downright mistaken: to say that everything has changed and to say that nothing has changed. The book by Fred Halliday is called 2 Hours That Shook the World. It's an instant book that was published. He updated some of his writings on Islam, about anti-Muslimism and that what's behind that, and I would commend it. And I put down 2 points to remember here. The Casablanca Economic Summit in 1994. I remember reporting on that economic summit, and many of us, and I was at fault along with others, believed that Casablanca Economic Summit would change irreversibly the economic relations between Palestinians and between Arabs, including Palestinians, and Israel. And we were wrong. In fact, it changed very little. And the Arafat-Rabin handshake on the White House lawn, again, was seen as a watershed in relations in the Middle East, and as our televisions unfortunately show us at the moment, to some extent, very little has changed. There are, of course, watershed events, so the Iranian Revolution, the 1967 war, so we shouldn't underestimate that. But the point I'm making here is that we should keep a degree of perspective. Tragic and awful though the events of 9/11 were, if we're looking at the impact on financial institutions, on Islamic financial institutions, let's keep a sense of perspective. The main impact of 9/11 on Islamic financial markets will be in that area where Islamic financial markets interact with Western financial markets. For example, we're seeing that some Western institutions are just more careful, they're more wary about dealing with Islamic financial markets. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion about whether they're right or wrong to do that. I'm just saying it is happening. Western institutions may curtail the expansion of existing Islamic operations, and in fact, I've seen one example of the reverse. A Gulf-based institution which was planning a major Islamic initiative, and after 11/9 decided that it was not going to do that. And there's a possible reduction in the availability of interbank facilities from Western institution to Islamic banks. I was talking recently to the man who effectively runs interbank credit for an Islamic institution in the Gulf, and his job is to go around the Western banks and try to build relationships with them. And he was saying that, yes, it did become a little more difficult after 11/9. But bear in mind a reverse effect here, which is that the effect of anti-Muslim sentiment in the US after those events made a lot of Muslims uncomfortable about remaining here. And some of them went back, and a lot of them have repatriated their money back. No. But many aspects of Islamic finance will be completely unaffected by the events of 11/9, and these are the areas which are managed primarily by Muslims for Muslims. And I'm going to jump to the third bullet point because I don't want Dr. Yahya picking me up and saying that LARIBA is not only for Muslims. I know that, but I'm just making I wanted to cite you as an example of an Islamic mortgage lender, but I know that you're not solely aimed at the Muslim community. I've given examples here of Islamic retail banks in Muslim countries. If you look at the statistics for the Islamic banking sector in Malaysia last year, then there is there is no change in the growth of deposits throughout the year. So one might have expected to see a withdrawal of deposits or a reduction in financing in the Islamic sector of the Malaysian banking market after 11/9. It didn't happen, right? Because those people who are investing don't really care what people in the New York Times are saying about Islam. They have a financial relationship which is important to them in their home country. We've also seen Islamic bonds being issued by Muslim governments. They're not, and I cite Malaysia, but also Bahrain, which has been expanding that Islamic bond market over the last few months, and that has been unaffected by the events of 11/9. So the clients of retail banks in Muslim countries, of Islamic retail banks, people who are buying, say, the Bahraini shukuk, the clients of Islamic mortgage lenders in the West, Islamic companies in the West, these people are impervious to the current scrutiny and criticism of Islamic institutions in the Western press, and the heightened concern and scrutiny by Western regulators. I don't want to be too hard on Western press. As a former journalist myself, I don't want to be hard on that profession. And there has been a lot of very good reporting about Islam in the last few months, but I think, as we all recognize, also some quite bad reporting. The scrutiny of financial institutions worldwide has been increasing, and Sami has made reference to this already. And this is unconnected to 11/9. It may be propelled to some extent by that, but it's unconnected, and Enron has already been mentioned. We can expect that accounting standards will be changed and tightened up as a result of Enron, and Islamic financial institutions are going to have to change and tighten up as a result of that. Greater scrutiny of offshore financial centers, that has been going on for some time, with international task forces naming and shaming certain centres which were deemed to be too lax in the controls that they put in place to avoid money laundering. Strengthening financial reporting standards, and there's a long-term effort to require and encourage stronger internal controls and credit scoring in banks. Now, the point here is that Islamic banks, and again I'm being quite frank here, Islamic banks have not always been as competent as they could have been in terms of internal controls. That doesn't apply to every Islamic bank, but there are certainly some where internal audit, internal controls are not as strict as they might be. It is going to be harder to get away with that in future. There is going to be much greater scrutiny, presumably from domestic regulators, but also from international regulators. So if you are an Islamic institution operating from somewhere, let's say in the Middle East, and you want to operate here, you're going to have to show a lot more in terms of your ability to manage risk. One of the main reasons why the Financial Services Authority in the UK, which is the successor regulatory body to the Bank of England, one of the key points the FSA asks if someone wants to come into town and set up a bank is, how good is your risk management? And it's going to be asking harder questions about risk management now as a result of post-Enron, greater scrutiny of offshore financial centres, international efforts to tighten internal controls and credit scoring. That will be propelled, given an extra push by the events of 11/9, now that people realise how easy it has been to move illicit money around the world. But the main point I'm making here is that we shouldn't see that simply as a reaction to 11/9. You've got to get with the program on all these things. And you would have had to get with the program on all these things if 11/9 had not happened. Just to step back from this, there's two ways you can regulate. You can have a rule-based system, or you can rule by the spirit of regulation. And the US system has been very rule-based. That is to say that here's the barrier, and as long as you stay this side of the line, then we don't have a problem. Whereas the European system has been much more that you have to stay within the spirit of regulation. And that's why we Europeans say that Enron could never have happened in Europe. We would say that, of course, wouldn't we? But the reason why we say it is because our system is much less rule-based. Now, I would expect that one of the results of Enron is going to be that there will be many more rules imposed. What happens with a rule-based system is, as long as you're staying this side of the line, you're okay. So everybody makes sure they're right here on the line. Because you're okay if you're there, but you're making your maximum profits. You've got the greatest leverage, whatever it is that you want to do to push your financial structure to the limit. You're fine. You're on the right side of the line, but you're taking a lot of risk. We're going to see more laws, more regulations coming into place post Enron. We can have a debate about whether that makes a financial system safer or not. There will be costs involved in that. It costs money to adhere to laws. Moving through, and I just have two more slides I'd like to address. The attitude of Muslim governments to Islamic finance is going to be a key to its development now. The governments of Muslim countries tread a difficult path in managing domestic Islamic sentiment. Okay, you have to let people let off steam. You have people in your society that feel more religious sentiment than the government does. The government has to allow these people to express their views. That's letting off steam. But on the other hand, they don't want these people to challenge their right to rule. You have to keep it under control. I'm not expressing an opinion on that, I'm just saying that that's how it is. And that's a difficult line to tread. Now, governments always influence and frequently control. I'm talking about the Middle East and beyond, the licensing of financial institutions. the regulation of financial institutions once they've been licensed. They control the enforcement of the law, and not just financial law, but they control the enforcement of the law, and they control the soft boundaries of acceptable religious activity. Okay, if you take the example of Egypt, and I'm sorry if I'm being too frank, but who gets arrested and when and for what reason and when they're let out can be decided by the government in order to decide where they want to tread on that fine line between allowing people to let off steam and keeping it under control. Okay? Now, the question is, how are they going to manage this at a time of very intense Islamic sentiment? All right, you've had a situation where people who are Muslims were responsible for some terrorist acts. You have people who are going around saying, well, that's how all Muslims are. We know that's not true. You have a situation where the Americans and their allies have been taking military action against a country which happens to be Muslim, Afghanistan. It may take action against Iraq. There's a lot of uncertainties here, of things that Muslims are trying to get their heads around, and how Muslim governments deal with that is going to be very important, and it's going to directly affect how Islamic financial institutions are treated in this country, in their own countries. And I don't know, and I'm sure there are people in this room who do know, but I don't. I don't know exactly how that situation is developing, whether Muslim governments are trending towards greater democratization as a reaction, or whether they're trending towards greater control, whether they're going to allow, for example, greater freedom to Islamic financial institutions, or whether they want to clamp down on them. But that's going to be an important determinant of the future of Islamic finance in the Middle East and in Muslim countries. And my final point is that Islamic finance is multifaceted. And this slide is really just me saying I find it very difficult to talk about Islamic finance as a single entity. You know, my remit is to talk on the effect of 9/11 on Islamic finance. And my response is really to say, but Islamic finance is multifaceted, and it's going to affect different aspects of Islamic finance in different ways. So it's difficult to define what we mean by Islamic finance. And some institutions which are not explicitly Islamic are operating in an apparently Islamic, in ways that are to some extent Islamic, and I quoted Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. So the impact of 9/11 on Islamic banks will be multifaceted. So it's very difficult to generalize about the impact. And with that, I'll finish.